It's a very warm welcome today to the Conversations with Humanity podcast to Nick Bendel. Nick, how are you today?
I'm very well, Mark. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for being so patient. I've just spent a whole lot of time talking to you off air before we started today, and I always gauge someone about how good they are at listening, and I have to say straight off the bat, you're a good listener, Nick.
Well, you're a good talker, Mark.
Thank you. Have you always been a good listener? Because that's not a skill that people are typically born with. It's something that evolves over time, I find.
I've always been more inclined to listen than to talk, but over the past year or so, I've been going on a particular journey, which I think we're going to be talking about in a moment, Mark, and that's turned me into an even better listener.
Okay, brilliant. We are going to get into that, but before we get there, we've got a little bit of homework to do, or should I say you have a little bit of homework to do. So the first thing is we're going to about 105 countries around the world today with this show. So tell everybody whereabouts in the world you are today.
I am in Sydney, Australia.
Beautiful. What a fantastic city. Have you lived there all your life?
I have, and I feel incredibly lucky to be here. It's such a wonderful place.
Which part of Sydney are you in?
I'm on the North Shore.
Okay, lovely. I lived in Mossman for 4 years and loved it. I absolutely loved it. It's a great place if you're an outdoorsy type person and you want to get down to the beach at Balmoral there, or if you want to do a bit of running around the inner harbour area. It's a lovely part. If you were saying to somebody 3 great reasons to come and visit Sydney, Australia, what would you say are the top of the list there, Nick?
I would say the weather, the harbour, and the lifestyle.
Weather, harbour, and lifestyle. Does it get cold in the winter?
It can get cold. Usually during the day it's a reasonable temperature, but at night it can get a bit chilly.
Yeah, indeed. But always a great city to come and visit. But because of our current situation and the lockdown and everything else that's going on, as I find out on my travel show and talking to people have got the passports hidden away in their cupboards at the moment and are not going anywhere. But look, when you're able to travel again, book yourself a ticket to Sydney, Australia. And who knows, you might bump into Nick. And
you can stay at my place. Everyone can stay at my
place. Be careful what you offer there, Nick. You might have a few thousand people turning up. Okay, well, the other thing that we'll do before we get into the heart of the show today, Nick, is I always offer my guests the opportunity to dedicate their show to someone special in their life. So who would you like to dedicate your show to today?
Well, I will dedicate the show to my parents, who I know are going to be listening.
Beautiful. What are their names?
Julie and John.
Julie and John. That's easy to remember, isn't it? Julie and John. This is a lovely dedication from your son, Nick, and you can perhaps all sit down and watch this together, Nick, afterwards, yeah?
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if we do.
Now, what do you do for a living?
I own a content marketing agency or a copywriting agency called Hunter and Scribe.
How long have you been doing that for?
For about 2 years, Mark.
Why do you do it?
Well, I've got a background as a journalist, and for many years, my contacts, maybe once every month or two, someone would ask me to do some freelance work for them. And I actually said no to most of them. I just couldn't be bothered. I now regret it. But eventually I kind of thought, all these people are asking me to do this. Maybe there's a business in this. And so eventually I started the business, and then I regretted all those potential customers I turned away.
Yeah, I bet. What was the scariest thing about starting a business?
Good question. I'd wanted to have my own business for many, many years, but I was too scared to do it. And the big fear was borrowing money and then the business failing and then not being able to repay my debts. And so that held me back for many years. But by the time I started the business, I'd actually gotten over those fears. And to help myself, I started the business as a side hustle. So I still had my job for about 18 months. And it was only after 18 months, once I built up the business, that I quit my job and I went out on my own.
And how was it for the first few months when you had the trainer wheels off? Did it feel like an enlightening moment in your life journey?
Oh, it was so exciting. So that was only 8 months ago.
Wow.
And
okay.
I left my job at Christmas 2019 and I started full-time in this business January 1, 2020. Funnily enough, I've been full-time since coronavirus hit. So some might say not the best timing, but I actually think it's pretty good timing because if you can succeed in a market like this, you can succeed in any market. And it's forced me to improve and lift my game. And to go back to your question, Mark, what was it like? Well, it's been so stimulating and so exciting. I've learned so much, and the growth I've had this year, I've had more growth this year than I think in the previous 40 years I've been alive.
Yeah, fantastic. I love to hear that, and it's a common theme that I'm hearing every day when I talk to people on my shows, is that the amount of positivity and opportunity and innovation that's happening. I was only reading yesterday that our dear friend Elon Musk has made $58 billion so far this year. So who says there's a downturn in the global economy when you've got a guy out there who's able to crack $58 million? It's billion, it was billion, $58 billion, yeah. So I love the attitude, Nick, and you've taken that throughout your life this year, because you're doing some really incredible things. And there's a particular project that you've got underway at the moment that was one of the main reasons I wanted to have you on the show today, because we've only just kind of connected online, and I heard about this and I thought, wow, this is really cool. This is right up my alley, and I bet a lot of people listening are going to love it. So why don't you tell us what this project is, first of all?
I'm in the process of having lunch with 500 strangers in 5 years. I started on August 27, 2019, and it's been a bit over a year, and I've had lunch with 120 strangers so far.
Wow, fantastic. Now, this sounds like one of those things that comes out of a pub bet or something like that with a few mates. Was that how this came about? How did it come about?
Well, it came about by pure chance. It was in May 2019. I was on LinkedIn, and there was this woman in Melbourne named Kaylee Chu who I was connected to. And I don't know why we were connected, because I'd never met her, never spoken to her, never had anything to do with her. And then she happened to do this post that I just happened to see, and the post explained that she'd had lunch with 100 strangers in 2018, and she just published a book about it, and there was a link to a website. So I clicked on the link, went through to the website. It seemed fascinating, so I bought the book, and I was immediately hooked. And almost from the first page, I thought to myself, I'm going to do what this woman, Kaylee Chu, did. I'm going to have lunch with 100 strangers in 1 year. But then maybe about halfway through the book, Kaylee mentioned that her lunches had been so fulfilling, and she'd learned so much and experienced so much personal growth that even after having the 100 lunches, which was her original goal, she was continuing to have the lunches. So I thought, if I'm going to keep having lunches once I get to 100, why set myself the goal of 100 lunches? Why not set a bigger goal? And so that's why I set the goal of 500 lunches in 5 years.
How did you come up with the number 500?
Well, it was bigger than 100. That was the main thing. I think 500 just seemed like a good round number.
Was that important, though, to do more than 100, more than what she did? Was that something that drove you to actually do more?
No, I wasn't looking to beat Kaylee, and we've become good friends, and Kaylee's just an amazing person. She's very supportive. So I wasn't looking to beat her, but I thought, so originally I thought I'm going to have lunch with 100 strangers in 1 year like Kaylee. But then I thought, if I'm going to keep having lunches once I get to 100, then it doesn't make sense to call it 100 lunches. I'll call it 500 lunches. And a little part of me, because I've got this background in marketing and media, a little part of me thought, if I'm contacting strangers and I'm telling them it's 500 lunches, maybe they're going to be more excited than if I tell them it's 100 lunches.
Yeah, right, okay. So how do you go about choosing the first person? Was there a kind of a bucket with a few people's names in it, or did you ring your mates to start off with and say, hey, we're going to have lunch together? How did you go about getting the first one on board?
Well, the story of my first lunch is very interesting, Mark. So the person I chose was very easy. I decided this woman in Melbourne, Kaylee Chu, should be my first lunch. So for the listeners, just to remind you, I'm in Sydney, Kaylee Chu is in Melbourne. And so I contacted Kaylee. I said, I've read your book. It was amazing. I want to have lunch with 500 strangers in 5 years. Will you be my first lunch? And if so, I'll fly to Melbourne to have lunch with you. So she said yes. So on August 27, 2019, I woke up at 5 a.m. and then I walked to the train station, and then I got the train to the airport, and then I flew to Melbourne, and then I got a bus to the city, and then I walked into a restaurant, and I walked across to the other side of the floor, and there was this woman waiting for me, Kaylee. I sat down, we said hello, we had lunch for 3 hours, it was wonderful, we hit it off. Then I got on a bus, I went back to the airport. I flew back to Sydney. I got a train, and then I walked home, and I walked through my front door at 9 p.m. And that was just an incredibly exciting, stimulating day. And that was my first lunch.
Yeah, what a fantastic story. Now, there's a whole myriad of questions that come out of the logistics of this process, right? And I guess with going to have lunch with Kaylee, first of all, it was a bit of a soft landing, wasn't it? Because Kaylee, excuse the pun, but Kaylee had already been there and done it, so she knew what you were about doing. So did that make it feel a bit easier for you in terms of, sitting down and having that conversation?
Yeah, I think it did, Mark. It was a little bit easier, and Kaylee was really excited for me and really supportive for the exact reason you said, Mark, but she realised the incredible journey that was ahead of me. And funnily enough, we agreed that we would have lunch every year on that anniversary. And unfortunately, she couldn't come to Sydney to have lunch because of coronavirus. So on August 27, we had a video lunch over Zoom, and we continue to be friends and we continue to be really supportive. And since Kaylee, I've met 119 other people.
Mm. So with the 5 years, how did you? I'm really interested in the planning of this, right? So you've sat down and you said, right, I'm going to do 500 lunches over 5 years. What determined the time duration? Was it just saying, well, I think I can do this many in a year? Was that what it was about?
Yeah, so Kaylee had done 101 years, so I thought 505 years, so that equals 100 a year or about 2 a week.
Mm.
And so I thought, yeah, 2 lunches a week, that sounds like a good number. I'm a little bit ahead of schedule because I've enjoyed them so much. And when I when I wake up on Monday morning and I look at my schedule and I see the lunches I've got planned, I'm really excited. The lunches are generally the highlight of my week, so that's why I've been maybe booking more than I otherwise expected to.
So after Kaylee, what was the process of getting new people into the web of having lunch with you? What was the process you've been using?
I'm looking to have lunch with a really broad cross-section of people, and I'm not trying to turn any of these people into clients. So I'm meeting lots of people who wouldn't be clients. I'm also meeting some people who might potentially be clients, but the reason I mention that is I'm trying to meet people I wouldn't ordinarily meet, because that means you're going to have conversations you wouldn't ordinarily have. You're going to be exposed to ideas you wouldn't ordinarily be exposed to. And so I'm trying to meet men, women, young people, old people, white collar, blue collar people from all backgrounds. And so when I contact people, one of the things that makes me contact a particular person, Mark, is if I think they've got a background that's new, where I haven't spoken to someone from that background, or I might be on LinkedIn and I'll stumble upon someone's profile and the profile will just look interesting no matter what their background is, and that's another reason why I contact people. Okay,
so is social media the kind of foundation place you go to find these people?
Yeah, I would say of the 120 I've had lunch with so far, probably 110 of them have come from LinkedIn.
Right.
And then the others have either been referrals or me contacting people outside LinkedIn.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that because I find that quite interesting, that probably now that you've done over 100, that people are starting to know about it and people are starting to say, hey, why don't you go and have lunch with Nick, or someone that you've had lunch with recommends somebody else. Has that started to happen as well?
It does happen, and I write a story about every one of my lunches, and I always post it on LinkedIn, and a lot of people are interested in following the journey, so people will sometimes read the post and then contact me over LinkedIn asking if they can come to lunch with me.
Mm. How does the financial side of it work out? Is it we going Dutch, or what's the story here? Have you got a nice Amex card that you flash across the table every lunch?
I would say maybe 90% of the time we've split the bill, maybe 9% of the time they've paid, and maybe 1% of the time I paid.
Mm.
With one of the times that I paid, I was with this kind of older, high-powered CEO, very experienced, and he pulled this power move at the end of the lunch, which I really loved. He said, Nick, thank you very much. I really enjoyed the lunch. My shout next time.
There you go. So how's that work out though? Do you preempt the financial side of it? Do you say to people we're going Dutch, or do you make a suggestion, or just let it flow per each person that you meet?
I let it flow. I have to I have had some people suggest that I should notify people in advance, hey, do you mind if we split the bill? And maybe I should, but I do find that a little bit awkward, so I just let us decide on the day.
Now, as I said, we've only just recently met online and don't know too much about each other. In fact, we're talking I was talking to you about my journey beforehand. So are you somebody that feels comfortable in talking to strangers? Is it something that's putting you a little bit outside your comfort zone, what you're doing?
Definitely. So that was one of the reasons I wanted to do it, Mark. I've always liked people, but I've always been kind of antisocial, an antisocial introvert, I sometimes call myself. So I've just kept to myself, and I've never really been much of a small talker and often felt uncomfortable making small talk with strangers. So part of why I'm doing this was to become more comfortable in that situation. I've always been more comfortable if I'm approaching someone with a specific purpose, but I've never felt comfortable if I was just meant to make small talk with a stranger, because my brain could never understand what the purpose was. And I wasn't really sure how to handle it, but now that I've had all these lunches, I'm much better in that situation.
So tell us about the impact it's having on you, because I think, that we're going to get into the stories and some of the stories that you've heard other people talking about, but I'm really fascinated about how it's starting to evolve you as a human being as you become more and more comfortable with what people are telling you. And we're probably in a similar position, I think, at times, because here on the podcast show, I get people to tell me things inadvertently that they probably wouldn't tell anybody else in their life, actually. In fact, I've had guests that tell me that quite frequently, that, wow, I didn't realize I was telling you that, and all of your audience at the same time. So have you had that experience as well, where you're kind of uncovering people's, I don't want to say deepest, darkest secrets, but things that they probably wouldn't tell a lot of people?
Yeah, that happens a lot, because with a lot of these people, we build, there's a lot of chemistry, and we get quite close quite quickly, and so the lunches can become quite deep. So I had one lunch recently where the person told me about his IVF journey, and he said, Nick, I've only ever told 6 people about this. And I'd known him for all of 20 minutes, and for whatever reason he felt comfortable telling me, which I was very grateful for. And there are quite a few lunches like that, Mark, where people are sharing these sorts of intimate details.
Yeah, that's really fascinating, isn't it? How does that make you feel, though, when people are offering that true sense of vulnerability in a lot of cases, isn't it?
Yeah, I feel very grateful that they're trusting me with this information, and I also feel grateful that the two of us have been able to make this sort of connection. And I sometimes have to remind myself, like, this is a complete stranger. I've known this person 15 minutes or 30 minutes, and somehow it feels like we've known each other for much longer. So I usually feel a sense of gratitude in those moments.
Do you think it's because of the context of what you're doing, that they know that you're doing this 500 lunch project, and therefore it makes them feel a little bit more relaxed, that they're not, I guess, a one-off, they're part of a bigger tribe that you're getting to meet through this process? Do you think that's one of the reasons as well, where they open up a bit more?
Yeah, I think, Mark, it's probably a few things. So I think the thing you mentioned is definitely part of it. I think another reason they might do it is I'm more of a listener than a talker, and because I'm listening to them, I think that makes them feel comfortable. And then another thing I've noticed is most of my lunch invitations get rejected, but the people who say yes, I've noticed that they're much more positive and open-minded and proactive than the average person. So I think they've got a much better mindset than the average person. And I think with that sort of superior mindset, I think they're more likely to open up and more likely to have the confidence to be vulnerable in that sort of situation.
That's interesting. A lot of people reject the invitation.
Most people do. I would say something like 90 or 95% of my invitations get rejected.
Really?
Yeah.
That really surprises me, because, well, I'm the type of person, if someone comes to me with something like that, I think, wow, this is cool. This is outside the box. Let's sit down and have a chat. In fact, I'd probably ask for 2 or 3 lunches with you to make sure that we have a decent conversation. Yeah. But that does surprise me to a large level, because particularly at the moment, because I think because of what's happening with COVID-19, I would thinking that people are wanting more human connection more than ever, but you don't think that's the case?
Well, apparently not.
Yeah.
But I don't begrudge people for saying no, because they might think I'm trying to scam them. They might think I'm trying to sell something to them. They might think I'm trying to marry them. They might think I'm trying to convert them to my religion. They might think the lunch is going to be boring. They might be busy. They only need one reason to say no.
Yeah.
And if the answer is no, that's not a problem. But as I mentioned earlier, the people who say yes, I think they're people like you, Mark. So you mentioned a moment ago that if a stranger contacted you and said, I'm having all these lunches with strangers, you would be really excited. And that's the mentality of the people who say yes. But people with that mentality, they're more positive and proactive and open-minded than the average person. I think not all the people who say no, but quite a significant number of the people who say no, they probably immediately think of all the things that could go wrong with this lunch. And that's why they say no. Whereas someone like you and like the people I'm having lunch with, I think they think about all the things that could go right with the lunch, and they get excited, and that's why they agree to the lunch.
Do you think this kind of, if we're looking at this from a psychological point of view, do you think this is a lot of the reasons why people live in a lot of fear? Because they just don't step outside their comfort zone to take on opportunities like this that are presented to them? Because let's face it, at the end of the day, if I'm sitting in front of you and then you start preaching about your business and you want me to come on board as a customer, you've got a right to do that, because we live in a society where we can talk about our business and open freely. But do you think people, I guess, what is it stopping people in terms of that fear factor? What do you really think's behind it?
That's a good question. I guess anything that is unfamiliar, our unconscious mind can easily feel threatened by unfamiliar things, even if we're not consciously aware of why we feel threatened. And a stranger contacting you to ask you out to lunch, it's so unfamiliar that I can't blame people or be surprised if some people just instinctively feel threatened. But I suspect that the people who are saying yes, I think, and I've noticed not only are they more positive and proactive and open-minded than the average person, I've also noticed that they're happier and more successful than the average person. Right. And I think these things are linked. And I suspect part of the reason they're happier and more successful is because they've somehow worked on their minds, and they've realized that if you want to be happier and successful, you have to take risks and you have to step out of your comfort zone.
Have you had any universities approach you to roll this up into some kind of study for human society or anything yet?
No, I haven't. I like that idea. That would be fascinating.
Yeah, I'm sure there's one out there that, I know a couple in Sydney that would probably be very interested to talk to you about that. Now let's get down to some of the nuts and bolts about the lunch, because I'm sure people are really interested to know here. What's the most common cuisine that you're having during these lunches?
Oh, okay, that's a good one. There's been a lot of Italian and Chinese.
Right. Okay. And who suggests where you go? How does that come about?
I like to find out where the person is based, and then I offer to meet them near their work, and then I'll say, Mark, is there a restaurant or cafe near your office that you'd like to recommend? And if they pick one, then I go there. Often though, they'll just say, oh no, Nick, anywhere's fine, and then I'll find somewhere near their office and suggest that.
Okay. Have you had anyone say, I know a good sandwich bar in New York City, can we go there and have lunch?
No, I'm waiting for that.
And what about the gender bias here? Is it mainly ladies or men that are meeting up with you for these lunches?
That's a good question. So when I started, I told myself I want to have lunch with 250 men and 250 women. And I think after I'd had lunch with 41 people, I did the count, and I discovered to my horror that I'd had lunch with 32 men and only 9 women. And I had like another 20 lunches already booked, and I think 18 of those 20 were with men.
Right.
So since then, I've been correcting the gender gap, the gender balance. I think it's gone from like 90% men, 10% women to maybe 65-35 now, but I do hope to get it to 50-50 by the end of the journey.
Why is that important?
Because I just figure I want to meet a diverse group of people, and most of my friends, because I'm a man, most of my friends are men, So if I want to be exposed to different ways of thinking, I should be meeting at least 250 women. If anything, I should be meeting maybe 300 women and 200 men.
Mm. And of the ones that are saying no, is that mainly women as well that are saying no?
I think the men and the women are saying no in equal numbers.
Okay. So you're not going out of your way to try to balance the scales by inviting more women at the moment, based on what you just said?
No, I am trying to invite more women.
Yeah.
But the women aren't more likely to say no than the men.
Yeah, right. Okay. And what about your conversation technique? How's that changed over the time? Are you finding yourself asking the same questions over and over again, like I do on my podcast show, or do you come up with a new script every time?
Okay. So this is interesting, Mark. So I think the 68th person I had lunch with, a bloke named Ronnie, I think he was number 68, he gave me this really interesting bit of advice, which he articulated something that I think I'd been unconsciously doing, but once he articulated it, I started doing it consciously. So Ronnie is really good with people, and he said one of his techniques with relationships and social interactions is he lets the other person talk about what they want to talk about. And I think I'd been doing that unconsciously, but since then I've been a lot more conscious about it. And so the conversation tends to go where the other person takes it. And so that actually, it not only makes them feel comfortable, but it means that every lunch ends up being unique.
Yeah, absolutely. And do you find common trends in conversation? Do people like talking about similar things? Like, is there a lot of conversations about their families and their friends and their work and all that sort of stuff?
Yeah. So generally when we start the lunches, they tend to be quite superficial. Where do you live? What do you do? How long have you been in your particular job or industry? Then they tend to get more personal, and we talk about families, we talk about goals, maybe we talk about fears, and generally the longer the lunch goes on, the more personal and the deeper it becomes.
What's the oldest person you've had lunch with so far?
Someone in their 70s, I think maybe 75 or so.
Okay, was that a man or a lady?
It was a man.
A man, okay. And what words of wisdom did he pass on to you?
Well, I really liked, it wasn't any particular words of wisdom, but I really liked his approach to life. So here's someone who, he thought his life was going to go down one path, he ended up going down another, and he worked really hard, and he dedicated himself to his profession, and he was able to rise through the ranks and build a really happy, successful life. So having lunch with people like that, it's really, as they say, you're the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with. So when you spend time with someone like that, it really rubs off positively on me.
Did you find him on LinkedIn?
He was a referral, actually.
A referral, okay. And what about the youngest person?
Youngest person would have been 23, and actually he was the 5th person I had lunch with. I have contacted a few uni students asking for lunch, but none of them ever replied. Now, this 23-year-old, they've probably got parties to go to. This 23-year-old, he was just so impressive. He just so smart and mature and ambitious. I compared myself to him when I was 23, and he was just light years ahead of me.
Yeah.
And it was great to be around someone like him, and I know he's going to be incredibly successful.
Yeah, I bet. And what's been some of the most amazing things you've heard that you can share on the show here today? You don't have to obviously say anybody's name, but you must have heard some really incredible life experiences.
Yeah, actually, I'll tell you a story which I really liked. So one of the people I had lunch with, she was born and raised in India, and at the time India was very conservative, especially kind of in terms of gender and sexuality. And when she was in year 8, she was at a private school, and the boys had shorts which went to just above their knees, so they didn't cover much, whereas the girls were expected to wear skirts all the way down to their ankles.
Right.
And she decided this was unfair.
Yep.
Why are the boys allowed to show off the flesh and she's not? So she cut off her skirt so that it was just above her knees, and which, like, India at the time was just unheard of and so scandalous. And All the teachers tried to get her to back down. She refused. The principal hauled her in, tried to get her to back down. She refused. He called her up on stage one day during assembly to humiliate her in front of the whole school.
Oh.
She still refused. He dragged her father in. She still refused. And she refused to back down. And I really admired her spirit and her individuality. And that's something that she hadn't told many people. And it was interesting to get to know her mentality and also her strength and independence. And I have people telling me different stories like that. And again, the person with IVF, for example, and explaining the journey that he went through and his wife went through and how difficult it was. And when you hear things like that, it really does give you an insight into people and human behavior and psychology that you wouldn't otherwise get.
Yeah, good point. And I was going to ask you as a relation to that was, has it changed, or is it changing your perspective on humanity as you see people based on what you've heard?
Yes. So a few observations. Some of the people I've lunched with are incredibly successful. And when you look at their LinkedIn profile, for example, you think, oh my God, you're the CEO of this and the owner of that, and you've won all these awards. And then you meet them, and some of these ultra successful people can be incredibly insecure. And so I can remember I had lunch with this quite a prominent person, and he started name dropping all these people. And when he said it, he kept looking at me as if, Nick, are you impressed with that name I just dropped?
Yeah.
I thought, wow, that's really interesting. He's trying to impress me, which I wouldn't have thought, because he was just so far above me in life. And so it is interesting that when you look at people from the outside, you can think one thing, but then when you meet them, you realize that I guess we're all people and we all have the same fears and insecurities as everyone else.
Yeah, absolutely right. And I say the same thing when we're across a microphone from each other as well, because it brings us back to a commonality that we're sitting there and we're having a conversation, right? And it doesn't matter what's on your business card, and it doesn't matter what you've done before. We're here having a conversation, and that shows the raw, true place of who we are. Yeah,
it does. And I should also, maybe to follow up, some of these really senior people I've had lunch with, just such nice people, perfect gentlemen or perfect gentlewomen, and just incredibly nice, and not the sort of arrogant, self-centered stereotype you might imagine of a successful CEO. And even though they were well above me, they never looked down on me. I can't imagine they would ever look down on anyone, and that's also a really valuable lesson.
Has anyone gone away and said, I'm going to do this as well, I'm going to go and have lunch with hundreds of people?
Yes, a handful have, and I've also had lunch with a handful of people who are on this a similar journey.
Right.
And funnily enough, one of my friends, he was really excited about this from the first day, and he, all throughout the journey, he kept saying, Nick, I'm going to do the same thing, but I need to give it some thought, because when I do something, it's always different, and I don't want to copy you. I'm trying to think of a unique way of doing it. And we had lunch a few weeks ago. He wanted to have lunch with me so he could get more information about this whole lunches with strangers thing. And then during the lunch, he announced that he was going to have lunch with 5,000 strangers.
Whoa!
And
5,000.
He hasn't started yet, but he promises he will. And he's the sort of person who, when he says he's going to do something, he follows through. He reckons it's going to take him 50 or 60 years. And he doesn't know if he'll finish it while he's still alive. But he loves the fact that it's such an outrageously large goal and something that he'll be able to do over decades.
Have you checked with Guinness Book of World Records to see if there is a record for this?
I haven't. If there is, I guess 5,000 is a bigger number than 500.
But you're not doing it to break records, are you, Nick?
No, I'm not.
So what's the saddest thing that anyone's told you?
Oh, okay. That is a good question. So I think a handful of people have told me about losing children or losing partners. That's very sad. And yeah, and that...
that was recently, like that grief was something they were still very much dealing with, or was it from a while ago in their lives?
It was from a while ago in their lives.
Right, okay.
And on the one hand, when they tell me that, a little part of me feels uncomfortable, but then on the other hand, I feel so grateful that I'm someone they just spent 20 minutes ago, and they're trusting me with this sort of information.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's really, really amazing. So, getting back to the logistics again? What's the furthest you're prepared to travel? And of course, we're living in challenging times when it comes to distance and all the rest of it. But you've already been to Melbourne. Are you prepared to fly across the country to Perth to go and have lunch with somebody, or what?
Look, I'm open to it. It would have to be someone extraordinary. If, for example, the Premier of Western Australia said, Nick, I want to have lunch with you, I'd probably fly to Western Australia to have lunch with the Premier, because how often would you get to have lunch with the Premier? So it would have to be someone remarkable. Otherwise, I mean, there are millions of people in Sydney. Otherwise, there's really no need to leave Sydney.
I want to play devil's advocate on that, because I had an experience recently that, I've been thinking about, who are all the famous people I can get on my podcast shows and all the rest of it. But what I've found out by chatting to over 200 people so far is that there are so many incredible stories in this world from everyday people who you probably go walking past on the street every day. And you and I are both in a unique situation where we're having in-depth conversations with random strangers. And I'm now very much less reluctant to fly across the country to meet a premier and talk to them, because I know that maybe the person next door to me on the sailboat next to me has got a better life story. And I'll just tell you one quickly. I ran into a gentleman not so long ago, and he's 84 years old. And he's just set a world record for sailing around the world solo at the age of 84. And he did it what they call the wrong way round. So he went against the prevailing winds and the prevailing tides and currents and everything. And this man's just a few boats down from me here at the marina. And I just thought, what an incredible story. So I sat down and I interviewed him. And I can tell you what, I've met some pretty amazing people around the world, and including people like Nelson Mandela and Christopher Reeve and so on. And I got more out of the conversation I had with him for 2 hours about his incredible journey of sailing around the world by himself at the age of 84 and all the life lessons that have come out of that than I could probably ever imagine getting from someone famous, So would you agree with that kind of philosophy as well?
Oh, without a doubt. Ordinary people have some extraordinary stories. I've just cancelled my trip to Western Australia to have lunch with the Premier.
Sorry.
So he's going to be very disappointed. I have noticed that through all these lunches, people will bring up things they've done or achieved that are just so extraordinary. And you realise that because I meet most of these people on LinkedIn, I see a profile, almost like a CV, and that's my impression of the person before you meet them. And then you discover that there are all these other things to them, and they can be incredibly impressive. So it doesn't surprise me that there's this 84-year-old whose boat is right next to yours, who on the surface of things just seems like an ordinary person. But once you talk to him, you discover he's actually an extraordinary person.
Yeah, that's so good. And I want to focus on, because one of the things that I sat down when I started this podcast journey was I said to myself, I want to become a better listener as a result of doing this. It's one of the aims that I have in my life, is every day focus more on consciously listening to what people are not only saying, but what they're not saying. And I'm sure you've picked up on this as well when you've been sitting there and you're able to use your senses when you look into the eyes of another person and you feel what they're actually saying to you. And it just adds so much to that conversation, doesn't it? It gives you much more of a roundness of connection with that person, even though that they're a complete stranger. Are you finding that?
Yes, I definitely am. So by listening, Mark, I'm able to better take in the nuggets of gold that they're dropping me. And they also realize that I'm actively listening, and that encourages them to keep talking, and it deepens the emotional connection, and it means that the conversation goes to places where I think it wouldn't otherwise go if I wasn't listening so much and if they weren't feeling so valued.
Anybody on the list that you've spoken to so far where you've just thought, I've got to have another session with this person, I've got to have a follow-up?
Well, I've had follow-up meetings with quite a few people. So funnily enough, last weekend, and there's a whole backstory to this, but I had coffee with 4 former lunch dates all at the same time.
And right, okay. So there's a mass connection happening here.
There is, and so some of the people I've met, I've become really good friends with, and I've had follow-up lunches, coffees, phone calls. So yes, there are definitely some people where we either hit it off or they're so fascinating that we do want to catch up again.
So when you sat down and started this journey, did you actually make a list of outcomes that you wanted to achieve by doing this?
I didn't make a list of outcomes I wanted to achieve, but there were some things I thought would happen, and they are happening. So just to take you through those things, Mark. First, I thought I'd improve my social skills, which I have. I also thought that I would learn a lot of things, which I have. I also thought it would be incredibly interesting, and it has been incredibly interesting. I also thought that I would build an amazing network, and I have been building an amazing network. And then I also had this vague sense that even though I'm not trying to turn any of these people into clients, I did have this vague feeling that the journey ultimately would prove to be financially profitable, because I had a feeling that by building this amazing network and becoming a better person, I would just start inviting opportunity into my life, and that is also happening.
That's really amazing, because a lot of people would say if you go back to the 1990s in Australia, the business lunch was known as the king of networking and the opportunity to pick up business from all kinds of different people. So you're saying that you're making a resurgence when it comes to the business lunch. Are you bringing it back into favour again, Nick?
I might very well be doing so. And I think part of the reason these lunches go so well is that I'm not trying to sell to them and they're not trying to sell to me. So it means that we're able to build a good emotional connection. Interestingly, you just reminded me of, I think it was the 86th person I had lunch with, Dilip, who originally from India, and he ran his family business in India. And he told me this really interesting thing he used to do. He would, several times a week, he would be on the road all day, and he would go and visit clients. And if they ever tried to bring up business, he would say, no, I'm not here for that, Mark. I just want to do you. Sometimes some of these clients just coincidentally were behind on their invoices. If they ever tried to give him money, he'd say, no, Mark, I'm not here for your money. That's a different department. I don't want your money. I'm just here to have a chat to you.
Yeah, right.
And so he even though they were clients, he wouldn't make it about business. And several times a week, he'd be on the road all day, and he'd just be meeting these people and just building relationships. And of course, once you do this and people realize that you care about them and there's this trust, well, they end up, as it is, being better clients and spending more money with you.
Yeah.
But so I think part of what's happening with these lunches, I'm not trying to sell to them, they're not trying to sell to me, but because we're building these relationships with each other, it's probably more likely that I might become a customer of theirs, or they might become a customer of mine.
Are you somebody, prior to doing this, were you somebody that trusted strangers quite readily, or did you have a trouble trusting people that you had never met before?
I've always been someone who trusts others. I'm probably on the naive side, I would say.
Okay. And what's the sense you get from the people that you're meeting? Do they immediately start to trust you after a few minutes of the conversation, and what you're doing is, not only ethical, but it's, you're there for the right reasons?
I've never felt that any of the people I met didn't trust me. I have a feeling, and this goes back to what we were saying earlier, the people who are meeting me, they're more positive and proactive and open-minded than the average person. So I guess I'm filtering out the ones who might have trust issues.
That's interesting, isn't it? Because, the old talk about the universe attracts like for like, and I guess that's the law of attraction is kicking in here, isn't it? You're bringing those people into your web that are like-minded.
It is, and I think that's part of the reason the lunches are so good. I'm showing up to these lunches in a really positive, open-minded frame of mind.
Yeah.
And these people are also showing up with a really positive, open-minded frame of mind. And I think that's why I built just these really strong connections with some of these people so quickly.
Terrific. What's the name of the book going to be, Nick?
That Now, you're the only one with the bookmark. I'm looking forward to reading yours. Now, because I've got a background as a writer, and because this sounds like a kind of interesting story, I've had so many people ask me, are you planning to write a book? When I started, I had no plans to write a book. I also didn't have plans to not write a book. Now, I kind of think maybe there's like a 70% chance I'll write a book. I'm still not sold on the idea, but I am increasingly thinking, yeah, okay, maybe I will.
Well, I'll tell you what, you've inspired me today from a number of different levels, and I want to share something with you today because I knew you were coming on the show and we're going to have a chat about this. I've done something similar to what you're doing at the moment, and I actually started writing a book about it, and I haven't finished it, but you've now inspired me to get my butt into gear and to get it finished. When I was in the corporate world, I was very privileged and blessed to be able to travel around the world almost on a daily basis to do my job. And I used to get very bored with going to company dinners and sitting around with the same people every night in a restaurant talking about the same stuff. So when I was in a foreign land, I used to take myself out of the hotel I was staying in and go down to a local cafe or restaurant and sit down and start talking to a stranger. And I started documenting those experiences over a 15-year period, actually. So I got to create a whole lot of conversations in writing that I had with all these incredible people, pretty much like what you've been doing. And I started a book called Conversations Around the World. And as I say, I haven't finished it, and you've now brought it back to top of mind for me to get my butt into gear and get it finished and put it out there. So thank you, Nick, for inspiring that.
That's fascinating, Mark. I can't believe you had all these conversations. Do you know approximately how many you would have had? Hundreds, thousands?
I had 79 conversations with people over that time. So I didn't set off in like you have with a specific number in mind, and it was very much, and some of the people were extraordinary. Like I actually sat down with a princess of a country one night without even knowing it, and she was in this cafe, and she was actually trying to run away into exile away from her country, and I happened to be the guy in the cafe talking to her that particular night. So there was that one. And then Hong Kong one night, I walked into a bar in my hotel and I started talking to a complete stranger, and she happened to be a Hollywood actress that I only clicked onto after a few minutes of talking to her, and she sat there and bled her heart out to me as well. So I've got a couple of notable members in the book.
Okay, now I'm dying to know who is the actress and who is the princess. Which country was she from?
Well, I'm not quite sure whether I can actually share the names because of what you said to me before the show in terms of people wanting to have their anonymity. But I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll put the name of the movie that the actress was in the show notes of the show today. So if people are listening to this or watching it and are genuinely interested to find out who it was, I'll put the name of a movie that she was in my show notes, and you can check it out as well, Nick.
Okay, and a follow-up question. What sort of things did Drew Barrymore tell you?
No, it wasn't Drew Barrymore, so there's a process of elimination. You've got a lot more to go now. But let's get back to you. What's the most amazing thing that someone's told you in one of these conversations?
I think maybe the personal stuff where they open up about, say, losing members of their family. In some senses, that's quite mundane because I guess we all die. But I do think that's amazing that they've just met me and they're prepared to trust me with that sort of information.
What's it like talking to people about grief and dying? Is it because it's a subject we don't talk a lot about as a society, right? It's one of those things. It's a bit like sex, I guess. We put it on the shelf and we don't talk openly about it other than our very inner circle. So when you're sitting down talking to someone about dying and the grief and everything associated with it, how do you find that? Do you find it an easy conversation to have?
No, I don't find it an easy conversation. And part of the reason I don't find it easy is I'm not sure how they want me to react. And I want to be very sensitive to their situation. I don't know if they just want me to listen silently. I don't know if they want me to comment. I don't know if they want me to answer questions. So that can be quite uncomfortable.
Have there been other topics that have been uncomfortable for you to talk about that people have raised?
Ooh. No, there haven't. I think that's maybe the only one. I've had a couple of people, interestingly, and this wasn't uncomfortable, even though when I'm about to describe it, it might sound very uncomfortable. Both of them had near-death experiences and broke almost every bone in their body imaginable, including all sorts of bones no one's ever heard of. And they thought they might be quadriplegics, and because they made full recoveries, they were open to sharing all that information. And it was fascinating. And one of these people who had this near-death experience a few months, so that was about 10 years ago, but then a few months before I had the lunch with him, his house had burned down to the ground, and which of course was confronting. And he explained that a lot of the lessons he'd learned from coping with his injuries had helped him deal with this devastating fire.
Yeah.
And I was amazed by how positive and upbeat he was despite this terrible thing. So on the surface of it, that might seem like it would be a very uncomfortable conversation, but because he was comfortable having it, it put me at ease.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because when you're confronted with a complete stranger, you don't know the topics, do you, that they're not going to feel comfortable with, and vice versa. Really, really, really interesting. So what's the plan when you finish? Like, do you think you're going to get to 500 and go, I'm going to keep doing this? It's too good a thing to pass up on?
I'm definitely going to keep doing it.
Yeah.
I think I'm going to have a moment of celebration. So I didn't really feel any particular joy when I got to 100 lunches. I didn't feel any particular joy when I had my 1 year anniversary. Lunch 100 didn't feel any different from 99 or 101, but I reckon lunch 500 will feel special.
Yeah.
And so I'll probably have a nice celebration, but then I'm going to keep having lunches.
So have any of the eating establishments reached out to sponsor you for going to their, I'm thinking of the Rockpool restaurant in Sydney, perhaps, that might be saying, hey, Nick, bring all your guests to our establishment and have lunch. Has that happened at all?
It hasn't. And maybe you want to contact Rockpool on my behalf, Mark.
Well, I'll tell you a little bit of a secret, Nick, and this might be something you want to follow up on, is the lady that runs that organisation is that just recently connected with you on LinkedIn, so you might want to check that out, right? Okay.
There we go.
There's an insider tip for you today, Nick. And okay, fantastic. Well, look, I think I've gone through my list of things that I wanted to ask you today. Is there anything you want to share about your experience that I haven't asked you about that you think the audience listening and watching to you today might be interested in?
Nothing I want to share about my experience, but I would say to listeners that I reckon you should give it a go yourself. It doesn't necessarily have to be 500 strangers. It doesn't have to be 100. It can be whatever number you want. But I think if you step out of your comfort zone and you have lunch with strangers, and if you go there without any agenda, not trying to sell anything to them, not trying to get any money from them, I think you'll be surprised by how much you can learn and also how stimulating you find the experience.
Yeah, that's a really good piece of advice, and I think because we're in such difficult and challenging times at the moment across the world, people have been locked away for a long period of time. They might be feeling a little bit isolated, and really there's nothing better than having a good, genuine conversation with somebody where you don't feel threatened or judged about anything, and you can just sit down and share whatever's on your mind, pretty much like we have today. Nick, would you agree with that?
I definitely think so. I think no matter what's going on in the world, I think human connections are relationship, and relationships will always be the centerpiece of life.
Yeah, brilliant. That's a great way to end the show today. And I'll tell you what we're going to do, Nick. I'm going to invite you back on the show after you've done 500 lunches, because I'm sure everybody that's listened to the show today has been really inspired by what you're doing. I think it's a fantastic thing. So on behalf of humanity that is listening, thank you for doing what you're doing, because I think it's a really great thing. If you want to get in touch with Nick, I'm going to put all his contact details in the show notes today, and either have lunch with the guy or check out what he can do to help you out from a marketing point of view, because he's a smart man and he knows what he's talking about. So Nick Bendel, thanks for coming on Conversations with Humanity today.
Thank you so much, Mark. I've loved it.
Brilliant. And we'll speak again soon, Nick.